My name is Fraser Chesterman, and I'm very pleased for the Trust in Innovation session to bring Richard Budel, Chief Commercial Officer of SICPA, to the table to have a conversation. Hi, Richard.
Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are, Fraser. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. And at the moment you're in the Middle East, aren't you? So we're recording from the Middle East. So
I'm sitting very close to an air conditioner as we deal with temperatures in the low 40s today.
Brilliant, thank you. So Richard, you are Chief Commercial Officer of SICPA and fairly new to this role. And obviously SICPA is an organisation, very interesting. We're going to hear a little bit about the company. But I want to start with you because actually, you know, you've got quite a broad background, certainly worked for lots of different organisations, both commercial, public sector, government. So just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure, this is my favorite topic, of course. I'm quite happy to touch on that. I'll try to keep it down to the 15 minutes that we've been allocated for the interview. You are correct. My name is Richard. I am the newly appointed Chief Commercial Officer, specifically with a focus on the digital portfolio at SICPA. And if any of the people watching this are like me, they might be asking the question, who is SICPA? So yeah. We'll try to save a little bit of time to get to that, because it was a question that I asked myself about 6 months ago when I was asked if I'd ever heard of the company. And rather regrettably, I had to say no, although that was a very specific strategy on the part of the business that we're in the process of changing. I'm a Dutchman, so if you ask my opinion at all during these interviews, you are going to get it. You'll get it very directly. I did spend about a third of my life living in Canada, so I always like to make the joke that as a Dutchman, you'll always get my opinion, but as a Canadian, at least I'll be polite about it. I probably get defined most commonly based on the fact that I've traveled an awful lot. When I moved here to Switzerland 4 months ago, it was the 21st country in which I've lived. I've been able to run projects in 77 countries around the world, and I've had the great fortune of being able to travel to 115. And quite often that can sound impressive, but I always like to point out to people that the only thing it proves is that there is as much of the world that I haven't seen as there is that I have seen. So it's really not all that impressive, but it does give me the opportunity to say quite often, well, this is how they deal with this problem in other countries.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So that's something that I like to try and bring to the work that I do. You're correct. My background has been a little bit varied. I might be accused of being a bit of a dilettante, but I started in a deeply technical roles, trying to understand exactly how technology worked. Had a very unique employment situation that resulted in my father being my customer, which meant that I was being very challenged on a regular basis to explain what was the value of the projects that we were trying to do. And I learned at a very early stage then to make sure that I understood why we were trying to do the technology, right? To understand that technology in and of itself has no value. The value is inherited or derived from what you actually do with it. And then after playing in the technical domain, I decided to switch over and do something a little bit different. And I worked as a business strategy consultant, helping companies try to figure out what did they want to be when they grew up and what was their life's purpose, to use the millennial terminology. And then started to realize that actually there was a real chasm between the articulation and the definition of a business strategy and the articulation and definition of technology. So I found a bit of a sweet spot for myself, sitting at the intersection between what a business wants to be able to do and how it needs to be able to act and behave. And so that's what I've been doing for most of the last 20 years. I fell into a government role in Canada, working as an IT director responsible for the public safety and security domains, completely fell in love with public service, but also came to realize that sometimes the bureaucracy and the administration associated with being a government employee can impede you from doing work. And so I bounced back and forth between public and private sector employment since then. And then came to the point where I am now, where I'm living in beautiful Switzerland, and I'm helping a company like SICPA deliver services to its clients.
Sure, sure. And when we were talking a little earlier, you were sharing with me a sense that you know, some of the organizations you worked in have been technology organizations, and that you feel quite strongly that technology, it should have a purpose. It should have a purpose. And you know, often, you know, we kind of accept things from technology companies that it's, you know, it's right and it's good and it's the development of the technology. But actually, I think that's an interesting one. That's an interesting area.
Well, if you would like me to speak about my personal manifesto, I will happily do that. But no, I think the point that you're referring to, Fraser, quite accurately, is that when I started working with government organizations, what I saw was a tendency for them to abrogate their responsibility around technology decisions. And to me, I've always characterized it as being a case where the technology is perceived as being magic because people don't understand it. And it's especially difficult for public servants sometimes because they have a very different career path than a lot of us do. And when they don't understand something, they say it's magic. And when you say that something is magic, what you're also doing is you're giving a power to the magicians, to the people who understand that magic. But at least when it comes to technology, we're giving power to people who don't necessarily deserve it, right? There's nothing particularly unique or special about technology that means we should treat it differently than any other capability that we've developed over time. And so what I started to see was that the people who understood the technology gained a disproportionate level of influence over the way in which governments started to do projects. And we've seen that in a lot of different countries. There are countries who've not fallen into this trap, and they've developed a very particular type of success as a result of that. But I think you're right. I think a big part of what I've been trying to do, and a big part of what SICPA has done, is help to demystify the technology and to democratize the projects and give government, again, a seat at the table.
Yeah, and particularly with SICPA, I know you're going to explain a little bit more about them. They have a heritage really in sort of money, currencies, exchange, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment in terms of development with blockchain and all the experience they have. But I just want to just finish off in terms of your relationships. You know, you said to me earlier, I've worked in local government, I worked in, you know, national government. I have quite a good insight into the way they think, and I just want you to sort of share with us your kind of thinking around how you can help. What you've learned from that.
Sure. So and maybe the best way to do this is to give a couple of concrete examples.
Yeah.
You know, we see, for example, that governments get very excited about the concept of open data portals, right? Where governments are standing up environments and they're publishing data into those portals and making that data available to anybody in the public and private sector to use. I think there's something really quite noble about that. And I think where we've made a bit of a mistake is to assume that the commercialization of that data should be exclusively the purview of the private sector. And so what we've seen historically is that there are a lot of private sector companies who've been able to commercialize public data to make very profitable business models from that. But very rarely do we see a flow of value back into the government. And quite often we can talk about the fact that, you know, everybody benefits when you have a successful economy because the money comes back through taxes, for example.
Sure.
But I think there are also a lot of examples that are hitting the headlines just in the last week about how tech companies in particular, but not exclusively, but tech companies in particular, have been able to generate astronomical profits. And because they've been able to close sweetheart tax deals with governments, and because they've been able to recruit the best lawyers and the best tax accountants, we actually don't even see that return of value through taxes. And so for us, for SICPA, for me, we see that as an inequity that we want to play a role in addressing. We kind of see ourselves being a little bit of a custodian of the public good in this regard. And that can sound terribly romantic and Don Quixotic, or maybe even Robin Hood, and I don't mean it to be so dramatic. But we really truly believe that somebody needs to be acting on the public sector's interests, the public sector's behalf in these discussions as well, and making sure that when there is the commercialization of government data, that the government has the ability to take a role in that. And we want to make sure that when decisions get made, that they get made for the right reasons. And we've seen some examples of that in recent history with the pandemic as well, where some governments immediately said the public sector is incapable of managing such a response, and they've outsourced everything. And now, as we have the benefit of sober second thought, as the pressure has started to be removed, and we're being able to go back and look at some of the decisions that were made then, we're finding cause to really question whether or not that was the right thing to do. And we see that acutely in the domain of technology. If we look at track and trace apps, for example, a lot of governments said, we're going to send that out. We're going to let the public sector, the private sector deal with it because they know the technology better than we do. And I think there's a lot of questions to be raised now, because there are examples of state-led initiatives that have arguably been far more effective than some of the private sector-led initiatives.
Yeah. You also mentioned to me, just as we wrap this bit up, a little bit about governments having the ability to control and also lead. So, that sense and control is probably a bit too strong, but that idea that they like to be in control and managing things, but they fail sometimes to also lead. And that, again, through the COVID crisis, you've seen examples of that, through a number of governments.
Yeah, we really talked there, Fraser, in my vocabulary about the concept of governance. And I learned very early in my career, 20 some odd years ago, that governance actually is successful if and only if it's a balance between controllership, which governments tend to do particularly well, and leadership, which governments don't tend to do particularly well. And in fact, if you look at it from a private sector perspective, quite often you see private sector companies, especially startups, are outstanding at the leadership part of it, but they fail if they're not able to address the controllership part. So the simple fact is you need both spheres represented on that spectrum. And in governments, a lot of the work that we've been trying to do is to make sure that we help them establish that balance, to move from an area where controllership is the only focus, and your accounting departments and your procurement departments and your security departments are all focused on controlling risk and controlling cost, to one where they actually start to take a leadership role. Because if you don't, it creates a vacuum. And what we've seen in the technical domain, at least, is that the technology companies are very, very quick to fill that vacuum. Sure. And then it leads to an inequitable relationship that we really need to try and address.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit more about, obviously, SICPA, and particularly the heritage, knowledge, experience that the organisation has, and how it relates particularly to blockchain, and as you and I talked about earlier, the kind of interest in these kind of subjects of currencies and technology and digital. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's a great segue, I think, Fraser, because when I started to tell people in my social network that I had left Huawei, the tech company that most people have heard of, and a company that I was working with in Italy, and that I was going to be moving to SICPA, everybody said, well, who is SICPA? And then they go to the website for SICPA and they see that SICPA is a company that has a history of over 90 years, almost 100 years, working in chemicals, starting with milking machines of all things, and then gradually moved through and is now focused on currency and doing some brand and product protection. But the logical relation between SICPA and companies like IBM and Huawei is maybe missing a little bit. But SICPA is a company that in its almost 100-year history really was successful in doing one thing, which is bringing trust and reliability and credibility to certain types of transactions. And it started almost half a century ago with the specialty in inks, and being able to create or enable the creation of physical currency that could not easily be counterfeited, it could not easily be tampered with, right? And it gave people the sense of confidence that if I gave you a 20 euro note or a 20 pound note or a 20 franc note or a $20 note, you could go off to the bank or go off to a store, right, and exchange that for 20 units of value. Because that bill, that paper currency was trusted. And SICPA has started to work in some other physical domains with some other products and making sure that those products are being accurately identified and tracked, and that taxes are being paid on it. Again, thinking about making sure that we help the custodians be, the government be good custodians of public money. And then SICPA came to a point where it started to realize that if it was going to be successful for another 94 years, it needed to start operating with a stronger presence in the digital domain. And so really that's when I decided to come in and join SICPA, to try and find those areas in which we can bring trust and credibility, reliability, and increase the confidence in digital transactions. Because if you think about all of the news in the last 5 or 6 years with the voting and whether or not you can trust the vote, whether or not you can trust the fake news, right? There's a lot of questions that have arisen about trustability in the digital domain.
It's that word, isn't it? As you mentioned it, it's so important now because social media and, you know, and truly governments have been, you know, are being questioned because of trust. So this is crucial. And one thing particularly that we all rely on is our ability to trust in money, in currency, in exchange. So it just represents such an important part that's actually even above government in a way, isn't it?
Indeed it is, because you're talking really now about the economies. And if you talk about the economies, you're always talking about the environment as well. And so we try to make sure when we look at things that we get that balance between economy, environment, and society. And you're right, money sits kind of across all of those. And that's a big part of what we're doing in the digital domain, of course.
And just to give us a bit of insight into, as you said yourself, you're 4 months into this role. Your background is obviously quite a technical background. You know, you're, as you said yourself, even at the start. And obviously SICPA, as we said, heritage in this area. Now we're kind of bridging this gap now. We're looking towards digital. We're looking towards digital in currencies and things like blockchain. What do you see in your few months there? What are you seeing? What are you sensing from the marketplace in terms of where this is going?
Yeah, I think there's right now there are variations on a theme, right? There are variations on this theme of technology-led initiatives. Right, the famous Gartner curve of, you know, peak of inflated expectations, the trough of disillusionment, and we're seeing an awful lot of that. One of the very first things that I noticed when I came to SICPA is that in this domain with these customers, there is blockchain boredom. Right, everybody has moved beyond the idea of blockchain as something that's cool and sexy. And if you talk about it that way, you're going to be disappointed because many of our clients no longer think blockchain is cool and sexy, and they've heard the promises for the last 6 years, right? But they've failed to see things really, truly materialize. So I think that's one of the things that I've noticed as I've come over here is that there is a greater skepticism about these technologies, but that's only true until the next new technology comes along and everybody's going to get really excited again and they're going to forget about how they dealt with e-business and how they dealt with cloud and how they reacted to blockchain, and we'll do it all over again. I think that's human nature, right? And the tendency to be attracted by shiny things. I think what we're starting to see right now, and I think the pandemic really accelerated that, is a focus on simply getting things done, making sure that we understand what has to happen, what has to be done, starting with a really clear articulation of what the end requirements are, what the end objectives and the end state is, and then trying to figure out what puzzle pieces do you have that will allow you to assemble the solution that gets you there. And technology is a part of that. It's not the only part. It's not even the most important part in a lot of cases, right? But the dialogue has changed a little bit to be extremely focused on the mission, on the purpose, understanding what needs to get done. If it's about getting PPE into hospitals, then that's what we're focused on. If it's about being able to identify new variants of an illness as it comes into a country, that's what we're focused on. And technology's taken a little bit of a backseat, but I don't hold any illusions that that will continue. And as I said, I think, we'll start to see a lot more excitement about technology in and of itself again in the future. But also combined with this, we're starting to see some of the real opportunities. There was a lot of talk about digital currency, but at a fairly low level, right up until the moment that Facebook announced that it was going to be launching Libra.
Own currency.
Now Diem, and suddenly every government said, well, wait a second, right? Money is our domain. We need to be able to do this. So we need to have a digital currency. And everybody's been talking about putting together their own CBDC, the central bank digital currency, and they're not entirely sure how they're going to do it. But what we now are starting to understand is the why.
Yeah.
Because if we think about coronavirus support payments, whether we're talking about individuals or whether we're talking about organizations and trying to keep businesses alive, or whether we're trying to figure out how to make payments into countries who need the support, suddenly there's a really clear use case for CBDC.
Sure.
Right? For being able to take a digital currency that you can distribute with the push of a mouse click.
Yeah. It's
and I think that's provided an exciting thing.
It's flow of money, isn't it? It's that ability to flow money quickly. And exactly as you said, it's, what the COVID crisis have done is identify sort of bottleneck points in our government's ability to share out resources in whatever way quickly. And I guess what you're saying is, well, look, that's what we're about. We're about that ability to look at how to flow money digitally.
Yeah. And then at the same time, we saw the exact opposite with the consumers, because the demand for physical currency is now higher than it has been in over a decade. Yeah. Central banks are printing more and more money than they have before, because money is still considered, paper money is still considered to be safe and reliable. And if you look at the peaks and troughs of the digital currencies like Bitcoin, you can see why some people think it's safer to still have money in the bank. But it also goes a bit further, and it looks at the behavior of buying, because we heard so much about the growth of e-commerce in the last 18 months. But if you've been to a grocery store in the last 18 months, one of the things that you might have noticed is that if you have a self-scanning option or a self-checkout option, it's open and it's available. And yet at the tills that are staffed by people, there are enormous lineups. There is a large part of society who still want to deal and be treated
in currency,
in analog and a physical way.
Yeah.
And I found this very strange. But in a pandemic, when a lot of things are uncertain and unclear, there is a calmness and a confidence that comes from being able to speak with someone and being able to deal with paper money. And this is one of the reasons why I think I might have mentioned to you earlier, from our viewpoint, we do see that there might be an end to physical currency, but that end is in decades, not in years.
Right. Okay.
And it doesn't matter how excited we can get about digital currencies and cryptocurrencies and everything else, right? We've had electronic payments with bank cards for a couple of decades already. And yet when push comes to shove, the paper money is still there. And so we need to rectify and resolve this difference between what we can do with digital currencies and digital technologies, and the fact that people still want to be treated in a very human world. And we should never forget, we are physical beings and we exist in an analog space.
Yeah, and there's certainly when we reopen, whenever that might be, then obviously we'll probably return to behaviours that we were familiar with before. I guess that in terms of the organisation and what you do, you're looking to work with both private sector and public sector and governments, and could be defence. Tell me what what's your interest? Where do you want to be going?
Yeah. So right now we have a history of almost 100 years that's focused on securing physical transactions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through money, through some specific products, being able to make sure that when you do an exchange, that what you've got is exactly what it purports to be, that it has the value that it claims to have. And it kind of makes sense then that as we start to transition into a digital domain, that we capitalize on what we've done. So one of the very first things that we're doing, Fraser, is we're focusing on that intersection between digital and physical. And I'll give you a couple of really good examples. If you go to get your vaccination or you go for a PCR test against COVID, right? Quite often you get a physical piece of paper.
Yeah.
And that physical piece of paper is really important because it will determine, as I discovered 3 days ago, whether or not you can get on a plane or whether or not you need to wait 24 hours because you didn't have that piece of paper, right? Or you can opt to have a digital document sent to your mobile phone or to your tablet, and you can present that. The problem is right now, either of those can be quite easily tampered with. You can forge it, you can buy it. It was only a couple of months ago that they were talking about the fact that the going price for a negative PCR test in the shady sections of some airports was about 140 pounds sterling. Right?
Yeah.
That price has dropped now. You can buy a negative PCR test for about 10 euros, depending on which airport you're at. And so we've got both physical and digital delivery mechanisms, but we don't have any confidence in them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of companies have focused on making sure that the digital certificate is secure and it's stored in a digital wallet and you can't tamper with it. But we don't have that same level of security with paper documents.
Analog, yeah.
And so we created a solution that we call My Health Pass that gives us the ability to do both. And so when somebody presents themselves for their vaccine or for their PCR test, we can issue them a certificate, both digital and physical, or one or the other, that has a QR code on it, right? And with some special technology and some special, I can't use the word magic anymore, but some special techniques, we've made sure that that QR code helps to authenticate both the digital and physical certificates. Anybody can double check it and tell you whether or not that document is safe. And we didn't just do the digital version, which is what a lot of companies have focused on, because of course we're in a new world where everything should be digital.
You could also do a hard copy.
Exactly, because there's a lot of people who don't walk around with a smartphone all the time, or who want to have that physical piece.
And that's interesting because in essence, what you've done is you said, look, we're seeing the issues that governments are facing and people are facing. We've got technology that we've used in currency in the past. We can apply this same technology into a card to show you've been vaccinated, and we can make it either digital or hard copy. Brilliant.
Exactly. Yeah. And so our role is actually really quite simple. We're simply providing a couple of those features that allow you to look at a certificate and feel confident that that certificate, whether it's digital or physical, is exactly what it purports to be, that that person had a vaccine or they had a test and that test result was negative.
Yeah,
right?
really good.
And we're looking to extend into other areas as well. And we're spending a lot of time now with governments focusing on those high value transactions where we need to make sure that both the government and the citizens or businesses, right, can trust that what's being exchanged is accurate, that it's protected, right? And that we're not trying to make a decision between security or privacy, because that's often the trade-off, and it's an artificial trade-off, because you can actually have privacy and security at the same time.
Yeah. Very interesting. And also, as you've pointed out, that could be government, but equally it could be large corporates that are wanting to look at their, security. It could be mobile technology, mobile phone technology. There's all sorts of areas this can go into. Richard, we're coming to the end. I was just going to say, was there anything fine, kind of wanted to just give us as a sort of final thought?
Yeah, I think really what we want people to think about when we talk about trust and when we talk about innovation is that we have an entirety of 8 billion people who we need to be able to engage and involve in the work that we're doing, whether it's public sector or private sector. We really want to try and make sure that the approaches that we take are inclusive, that we are addressing everybody, and that we're not just focusing on the privileged few, because quite often it's those people who are already marginalized who suffer the most when we focus only on technology. And we're trying to make sure that when we talk about innovation, we talk about trust, that we have that inclusivity engaged in this, and that we make sure that public and private sector are working together in a partnership. And that doesn't just mean paying for the development of something, but it also means sharing in the benefits that accrue as a result of that. And, you know, trying to make sure that when we have transactions, we all have that confidence that what we're transacting with is trusted, and that we're engaged with a reputable partner. Yeah,
and that's such great value to a post-COVID world, isn't it? That
Indeed.
Nothing else. Let's hope we've learned something as we've gone through this, and this helps us to reflect some of those new ways of thinking. So, Richard, listen, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really good to hear your thoughts, to hear a little bit about SICPA, and if people want to get in touch with you, there'll be, I think your email address will be made available. It's been absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much to you.
Thanks, Fraser. I really appreciate the time. And as you can imagine, I quite enjoyed having the opportunity to talk and share an opinion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.